Welcome to Part 2 of our overview of Behavior Support Plans, or BSPs. As was the case for Part 1, we will view the presentation and then complete a quiz for Part 2. This presentation will be focusing on documentation for BSPs. We will look at the various parts of the BSP datasheet itself, and then we'll walk through how to enter both behavioral data and what we'll refer to as ABC data. As you might remember from your positive behavior support training, accurate data collection is very important for so many reasons, including monitoring an individual's progress, providing information for clinical decision making, and giving an indication that an intervention is useful. As we discussed earlier, only a few BSPs are currently being run through Therap. If you are assigned to work at a home where one or more electronic BSPs are in effect, you will receive specific training for this. For purposes of this training, we will only focus on the paper and pencil version, since the majority of BSP data are currently recorded on paper forms. These forms are located in each individual's DDB. This is an example of what a data collection sheet for Betty Boop might look like. The first thing you'll notice is that Betty's name is at the top. Right below that is one of the most important and most often overlooked pieces of information, the date. Take a second when you're filling in your data and just double check that the date has been filled in. Let's take a look at the different sections you'll find on the BSP datasheet. The shaded section at the top includes instructions for filling out the data sheet and definitions of the behaviors that are tracked as part of the BSP. Under this section, you'll see a series of columns and rows. The time will usually be the first column, and you'll notice that each interval equals 1 hour beginning at midnight or 2400. The remaining columns have headings indicating the replacement behavior or behaviors and the target behavior or behaviors. And for our example, we will also be tracking Betty's mental health indicators and her sleep. There's a column to indicate whether restraint was used, a column for your initials, and a comments column. Remember that although every BSP is different, and therefore what data are recorded is also different, most data sheets will follow this basic format. Completing the data sheet is pretty straightforward, even though some can have a lot of different things to document. Basically, to complete a data sheet, you'll be indicating a yes or no answer. For example, if Betty asked for a break appropriately, or if physical aggression, SIB, or verbal aggression occurred, circle Y for yes. If not, circle N for no. If target behavior is observed, try to complete an ABC datasheet that is on the reverse side of the datasheet. We'll look at ABC sheet in a few moments. Sleep is recorded in the same yes or no fashion. Feel free to write a short comment if it is appropriate. For example, staff may make a note if Betty got up for personal care and returned immediately to sleep. If for some reason Betty was not under BSDC staff supervision, as might be the case if she is in the hospital or gone for a home visit, you would not fill out the BSP datasheet, just indicate where she is in the comment field, and resume entering data when she has returned to BSDC supervision. Finally, indicate yes if any type of restraint was used during the interval. Under the instructions, you'll find definition of the replacement and target behaviors. These definitions are the same as what are listed in the BSP document itself. Also note that, for our example of Betty, we would also like to track mental health indicators. You'll see that you'll circle BV for bizarre vocalizations and D for depressive symptoms, if either of these occurred during the interval. Otherwise, you'll circle N for no. Now let's spend a few minutes on our ABCs. This may be familiar from your positive behavior support training, but we'll go over it briefly here just as a reminder. A stands for antecedent, which is anything that happens in the environment immediately before the individual engages in a target behavior. B stands for behavior, specifically the target behavior that we're trying to reduce. And C stands for consequence, which is what happened immediately after the behavior. Now, why is ABC data important? Well, remember, ABC data helps us get an understanding of what is going on in the individual's environment that may be contributing to the problem behaviors. We can establish patterns and design interventions that will help to effectively reduce these problem behaviors. Whenever possible, ABC data should be recorded on the BSP datasheet every time the individual engages in a target behavior. Let's take a look now at the ABC datasheet. As we said before, this will be printed on the back of the BSP datasheet. First of all, remember to put the correct date in the space provided. When you're completing this sheet, also be sure to enter the time of day in the space provided. Some generic antecedents and consequences have been numbered so that staff can quickly circle the number of the corresponding antecedent or consequence. In the behavior column, be sure to describe exactly what the behavior looked like. An example of that might be, Betty hit staff on the face with an open hand. Sometimes we don't know exactly what the antecedent is because we only see the target behavior occur. Do your best to describe what was going on before the behavior occurred and record exactly what you did or what happened immediately after the behavior. At the bottom of the ABC datasheet, you will find the codes for typical antecedents and consequences that we often see. Circle the number that best corresponds with the antecedent and consequence that you saw. Sometimes there may be more than one. If none of the provided options seem to be appropriate, you can circle 7 and give a brief description of what occurred. Here's a close-up of the top part of Betty's datasheet. Let's walk through filling out a few intervals worth of data. Starting at midnight or 2400 on third shift, we observe that Betty was sleeping for all of the 2400, 0100, and 0200 intervals, so we have circled yes for each of these intervals. We also want to take credit for our work, so we're going to make sure to initial each interval as documentation is completed. Betty was awake briefly to use the restroom during the 0300 interval, so we will circle N for that interval. Betty is able to fall back asleep fairly quickly after using the restroom, so we will add a note in the comments field about why she was awake. This can be a pretty simple note, but it will let the behavior analyst know more information. Betty was then observed to be asleep for the entire 0400 and 0500 intervals, so we will mark yes for these. She woke up at 0630 to start getting ready for her day. Here again, we can make a note that Betty got up at 0630. Here's a trick to save you a little time. If Betty was asleep, notice that we do not have to circle anything for the replacement or target behaviors, mental health indicators, or restraints. If Betty was asleep for the entire hour, she obviously would not be engaging in any of these behaviors. On the other hand, we would want to indicate whether any of these occurred during the times that she was awake. Let's say that she did not engage in any of these behaviors when she got up to use the restroom. So we would simply mark no for all of these behaviors for that interval. Now you might be wondering why we haven't circled no for requesting escape, Betty's replacement behavior. You also might notice that there is an additional response option here of NA. NA is kind of a special circumstance that you will see on some, but not necessarily all, BSPs. In Betty's case of requesting a break, we want to distinguish between a simple yes or no, which we could interpret as simply did she or didn't she, versus the opportunity or the reason she would have for requesting a break. So you might look at yes or no, meaning that she had a reason to ask for a break and either did or did not ask for a break. In this case, we have chosen NA for the 0-300 interval because Betty didn't request a break, but she was only getting up to use the restroom. So marking NA in this case means that Betty didn't request a break and she didn't have any reason to. And for our example, we'll assume that the same was true when she got up at 0630. NA response options can be a little tricky until you're completely familiar with each individual's BSP. When you get training on a specific individual's BSP, the rules around when to use no versus NA will be discussed more specifically. Now let's walk through a few more intervals as Betty moves on with her day. So you'll notice the 0700 hour, we didn't observe any target behaviors or mental health indicators. Betty was not asleep and restraints were not used. She didn't have a reason to request a break. During the 0800 interval, we did not observe any target behaviors. She was not asleep and restraints were not used, but Betty did demonstrate the mental health indicator of bizarre verbalizations. Staff responded appropriately by listening and redirecting her back to the here and now, and then prompted her to ask for a break. Betty did ask for a break, so we will circle Y for yes this time. Let's look at an example of documenting an interval during which a target behavior occurs. During the 0900 interval, we observed an occurrence of verbal aggression. Because we observed a target behavior, we also need to complete the ABC data on the back of the sheet to describe what happened. So here's a portion of the ABC side of the data sheet. We'll of course remember to enter the date and the time the target behavior occurred. We'll fill in the antecedent, or what happened immediately before the target behavior, describe the behavior in detail, and describe the consequence, or what happened immediately after the target behavior. Remember, the antecedent and consequence codes are listed at the bottom of the ABC sheet. You can circle the corresponding number to help save time. For our example, we'll describe that Betty was in her room and a med aide who usually works at a different home and who Betty doesn't know very well came in to give Betty her medication. We'll describe that briefly in the antecedent box. When looking at our antecedent codes, this looks like a demand because staff asked Betty to take her meds. So we'll circle number 1 for demand, but we might also want to circle number 7 because of the fact that it was unfamiliar staff entering her room, and we already know that Betty doesn't like new or unfamiliar people. Next, we'll describe her behavior, which in this case was verbal aggression. We can quote exactly what she said, which will give better information rather than just saying that she was verbally aggressive. And next we'll complete the consequence box. Here staff ignored the verbal aggression, which is consequence code number 1, and did not provide Betty with attention. Betty then calmed down and asked for a break, and staff followed the BSP and gave Betty 2 minutes alone, and that's consequence code number 4. Now, a couple of additional details about documentation are worth noting here. First off, if you're completing ABC data about a target behavior and you need more room, you can always use multiple boxes to get the information to fit in. You can also document using a T-log on Therap if you need lots of room to describe what happened. Speaking of T-logs, it's also important to remember that the behavior analyst is one of the few people who will see the information you fill out on the BSP datasheet. Therefore, if you observe something like apparent pain, injury, confusion, and so on that other members of the team should be aware of, you should always document these occurrences appropriately in addition to completing the BSP datasheet. This completes Part 2 of the BSP Overview presentation. You will next be completing the quiz for Part 2. As we mentioned at the beginning of Part 1, there will be a separate training presentation to orient you to Behavior Support Guidelines, or BSGs. Thank you for your attention to this orientation to behavior support plans. We hope this presentation has been useful in introducing you to BSPs. As you move forward in your training, the Behavior Support Specialist for your home, or ICF, will provide in-servicing for the BSPs or BSGs for the individuals you will be working with. In the meantime, welcome to BSDC.